Well, welcome everybody. I know we still have a few people joining us, but I'd just like to do an introduction of what this seminar series is about and welcome you all. My name is Ali McManus. I'm a professor in the School of Health and Exercise Sciences at the University of British Columbia in the Okanagan. And this is the second of a series of 3 seminars that the North American Society for Pediatric Exercise Medicine are hosting in lieu of the 2020 conference that we would have hosted in the Okanagan last summer. We would have loved to have welcomed you to the beautiful Okanagan. It is the unceded traditional territory of the Syilx people, and we are very privileged to live and work here, and it would have been fantastic to have been there live, but we're thrilled to have been able to put together a seminar series from 3 of the keynotes who would have spoken at NASPEM 2020. We're also thrilled that our chair for the 3 seminars, Sarah Moore, she is an assistant professor at Dalhousie University. She's also the secretary of NASPEM, and she's going to be introducing our speaker today. But before we start, I have a few housekeeping notes for you. Let's just change slide. So just some rules of engagement, please. Please keep your mic, you're all muted and your video is off throughout the session. That will be the case for all of our webinars. But we will have the chance to have questions at the end of the seminar. And if you can, please type your questions into the Q&A function that has been enabled. You can see that on your toolbar in your Zoom. And Sarah will then be able to host the questions for our speaker today. The session is going to be recorded, so we will send everybody who's attended a link, and the link will also be posted on our school website as well as the NASPEM website. And this is just a sort of save the date for your diary before we start today. The last of our seminars is on Friday, the 11th of December at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And it will be hosted, or the seminar will be given by Dr. Kelly Arbour Nikotopoulos from the University of Toronto. So I hope you can put that in your diary and join us for the last of the seminar. And if you are interested in NASPEM, it's a neat community of pediatric exercise researchers. Please drop Sarah an email. So again, you can do a quick screenshot of this slide. So without further ado, I would like to pass over to Sarah, who is going to introduce Professor Dunstan today for our seminar.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Ali. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this NASPEM webinar today. NASPEM, as Ali mentioned, is the North American Society for Pediatric Exercise Medicine, and is an organization that promotes physical activity, fitness, and exercise science for children and adolescents. It was founded in the 1980s and has a really strong history of excellent science and collaborative work. Stay tuned. We'll be launching our new NASPEM website soon. This year, as Ali mentioned, NASPEM was canceled. Our meeting was canceled due to COVID-19. And as such, this webinar series was created. And thank you to Dr. McManus for putting this together. Today, I am pleased to introduce Professor David Dunstan. Professor Dunstan's presentation will be followed by Q&A. And so please, as Ali mentioned, use the Q&A function that's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can type those in throughout the talk, and I'll read your questions at the end. Professor Dunstan's research program encompasses the interdisciplinary crosstalk and integration of observational, experimental, mechanistic, and intervention evidence on the role of sedentary behavior and physical activity in the prevention and management of chronic disease. Professor Dunstan has spent his career investigating the health impacts of sedentary behavior, and he has ranked in the top 1% of the highly most cited researchers globally. Please welcome Professor Dunstan.
Thank you, and thanks for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to Ali for kindly inviting me to present today. And hello, wherever you are. I'm down in Melbourne, where it's Friday morning, and my presentation's going to focus on what has really been a focus of my research over the last 10 to 15 years is the role of sedentary behaviour, or too much sitting, in a public health perspective. As the title suggests, I'll be looking at not only the evidence, but also discussing potential solutions across the lifespan. But of course, I would have loved to have come over to Canada, but 2020 has been a year that we would all like to put behind us. Down here in Melbourne, we've borne the brunt of a second coronavirus wave, and I was just looking yesterday. I was scheduled to come over to Canada right at this time, and as you can see, Victoria was in a lot of trouble. But fortunately, we've now recorded 21 days of no active cases, no new cases. So we're looking, or we're cautiously optimistic that we're coming out of this. But of course, would have loved to have come over to visit over there in Canada. Okay, so my presentation is really anchored around a publication that we had in Annual Reviews of Public Health this year with my colleagues. And this was centered around a program of research, or a center of research excellence, that we were fortunate to receive funding from our national research agency to look at sedentary behaviour across the lifespan. And as you can see, there's a host of authors on this paper, but with key colleagues being Neville Owen, Genevieve Healy, many people would have heard of, and of course Joe Salmon and Anna Timperio, who do a lot of work on sedentary behaviour in children. So before I introduce the presentation, I thought it's important to show that there has been a lot of progress made in the role of research into the role of sedentary behaviour since 2020. Back in 2010. Back in 2010, we were invited by Exercise Sports Science Reviews to summarise the evidence over the last 10 years. And this was published back in 2010. But since then, there's been an enormous amount of research activity looking at understanding the role of sedentary behaviour. And you can see, papers, publication counts have increased exponentially over that year. So that is what the Annual Reviews of Public Health publication was directed at, is to summarise that evidence that has accumulated so rapidly over the last 10 years. So I'm going to break my presentation into 5 parts, and some of this is pretty straightforward for this audience, I'm pretty sure. But just to look at some of the definitional aspects initially, and then moving into summarising the observational evidence that has been generated over the last 10 years or so. But importantly, ourselves and others have started to take this beyond just the epidemiology and into clinical and experimental trials to start to understand what are the biological mechanisms of prolonged sitting on health outcomes. But then I also think that we need to focus our attention on identifying potential solutions, and I'll talk a bit more about that, and finish with some of the challenges and future opportunities. So just to kick off, I'm pretty sure this audience knows that we now acknowledge that physical inactivity or not meeting current physical activity recommendations and sedentary behaviour are distinct health concerns with unique impacts on various health outcomes. And this is just a bit of a funny, which is probably from your neck of the woods there, but I think this audience is well aware that regular exercise is so important, and that there are many health benefits that can be generated from regular exercise. And just to note that by definition, we classify people as active of meeting the current recommendations of 150 minutes or more of moderate intensity physical activity, whereas those that are not achieving that are considered to be insufficiently active from a public health perspective. Why is this so important, this insufficiently active? Well, the WHO back in 2018 produced a report in the Lancet Global Health showing the global prevalence of insufficient physical activity And you can see across the world, you know, there's fairly high prevalence in many countries. And in summary, according to the figures that are obtained from WHO, 1 in 4 people around the world are insufficiently active. And this is likely to be an underestimate because the WHO's endeavours included occupational physical activity, which is probably underrepresenting the amount of regular, moderate to vigorous physical activity people are undertaking. The other thing that has become quite apparent is that, recently, as you've probably seen, the Canadian 24-hour guidelines have been now extended to adults along with children, is that from a time a person wakes up to a time a person goes to sleep, or waking hours, many hours can be spent essentially sitting. Even though a person may be physically active, intermittently throughout the day and accumulate that 30 minutes of physical activity, they could also sit for long periods. And this is just illustrating an example of an older individual where there's many different opportunities to undertake periods of sitting. So this is really putting forward that whole notion of the active couch potato. A person can be active, but also highly sedentary throughout the day. So really shifting the focus on looking at all the waking hours and what people are doing during those hours. The other key concept that has really started to be embedded within physical activity guidelines, etc., is this notion that physical activity occurs across a spectrum. And traditionally, the focus has been on this moderate to intensity physical activity, because there's this enormous amount of evidence showing that such activity is beneficial for multiple health outcomes. And of course, the higher intensity leads to benefits as well. But there's been a new focus on understanding below this threshold of moderate intensity activity, what are the likely benefits of light intensity activity. But of course, looking at the lowest end of the physical activity spectrum is sedentary behaviour, which the Sedentary Behaviour Research Network has defined sedentary behaviour as any waking behaviour which is characterised by that low energy expenditure while in a sitting, lying or reclining posture. So there's been increased attention of looking at physical activity right across this spectrum. So I'll move on now to summarising some of the observational evidence on sedentary behaviour health, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there's really been a progressive evolution of the measurement methods to better understand the role of sedentary behaviour in health. And this is just a timeline illustrating that early days we were relying on self-reported methods which were based on single item questions, and this has progressively moved to better capture the multiple domains of sedentary behaviour, for instance, TV viewing, computer use, occupational sitting, as opposed to a single item question. But perhaps what's been given the greatest impetus for understanding sedentary behaviour in health has been the advent of these device-based measures, the actigraph accelerometer to look at activity intensity, and then the active PAL inclinometer device, which is worn on the thigh, where not only these devices have given us a picture of the total sedentary time across the day, but increasingly groups are starting to tease out the accumulation patterns. For instance, prolonged sitting versus interrupted sitting appears to be more detrimental to health outcomes. And as we progress into 2020, we're starting to see machine learning methods to really increase the accuracy of these devices for sedentary behaviour. And more studies are using combined data from both these devices. So we've really come a long way in measurement of sedentary behaviour. This is just a snapshot of data from an Australian study the Odds Diet study, where we had around about 700 or so Australian adults aged over 35 who were participating in the Odds Diet study, and we asked them to wear the Actigraph accelerometer on the hip and the ActivePower device on the thigh, and they both wore them for 7 days. Now, this is the average across average daily time spent in these various behaviours. And I think what's most striking is that if we look at this waking hour day, there's 9.2 hours essentially spent in sitting time. And if we break that down even further to look at a sitting that is considered to be prolonged sitting, or 30 minutes or more bouts of sitting, that's nearly half of the total time spent sitting. So the average Australian adult is sitting for long periods and in prolonged sitting. And with the remaining part of the day distributed between that light intensity, which is a larger volume, but only a small amount is essentially spent in that moderate intensity physical activity. Just other insights that have been generated from particularly the ActivePower device, as I mentioned before, is that we can start to better understand sitting accumulation patterns. And I've just illustrated 2 cases that we've taken out of the Odds Diet study. And just this is representing a 24-hour day with sleep in the white here. And you can see red is the sitting time, yellow is light intensity activity, and moderate intensity in orange. This person here, and just a note, these 2 people essentially have the same volume of sitting across the day. But as you can see, that this person up here, what we would call the prolonger, is accumulating that sitting in long periods of sitting. So you can see here a prolonged period of sitting. The person down below is accumulating same amount of sitting time, but what they're doing is interrupting their sitting frequently with intermittent bouts of either light intensity activity or moderate intensity activity. So it's really taken us to a different level in terms of understanding not only the total volume, but also the patterns of accumulation in relation to health outcomes. I think one important principle that has really been shown through these device-based measures is that sedentary behaviour is the antithesis by definition of physical activity. And what I mean by that is that as people wear these devices, there is this balance between the time spent sitting and time spent in total physical activity, and that includes light intensity activity and moderate intensity activity. And as this balance, so as a person shifts to increasing sitting time, increasing sitting time will lead to an overall reduction in total physical activity. And vice versa, increases in total physical activity, by definition, a person would reduce their amount of sedentary behaviour. And it's timely that we acknowledge this, and we've just recently had this accepted in Nature Cardiology Reviews, where we put through this hypothetical case of a physically active person pre-COVID, and with the restrictions that have been imposed, we hypothetically, some of that light intensity activity has been overtaken by increasing the amount of time spent sitting. And you can see here the total physical activity has reduced. So the balance has essentially been flipped, where in the post-COVID with the social distancing and working from home aspects has led to an increased amount of time spent sitting, and as opposed to that, decreases in total physical activity. This is a really important principle because, as we'll talk about some of the experimental studies, that if we are to target sedentary behaviour, the countermeasure must be physical activity, and I'll come back to that. Over the last decade or so, there's been an enormous amount of studies, as I showed earlier, that have looked at the relationships between high sitting and increased risk of chronic disease. And fortunately, the most comprehensive review of the evidence has come from the US 2018 Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee. And I've just summarised some the key findings from this. And if we just take a look here, this is looking at the level of association of high sitting versus low sitting with the various health outcomes. And it was summarised that there is strong evidence linking high sitting to all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, incident type 2 diabetes, and also incident cardiovascular disease. One thing to note, though, is that the level of evidence for variation by association by physical activity is quite strong for all-cause mortality, whereby those who are physically inactive, it appears that the risks associated with all-cause mortality are most pronounced in those who are physically inactive, as opposed to those that are more physically active. And this has been illustrated in a very large trial based on self-reported data to look at the interplay between physical activity and sedentary time. And this is published back in 2016. Remember, this is based on self-report, not the device measures that I mentioned earlier. And it's a fairly busy slide, so I'll just walk you through this. In this study, Eklund and colleagues pooled various studies that have been undertaken around the world, which the outcome used the outcome of all-cause mortality. And what they were able to do is, having such large numbers, create categories of physical activity from high amounts of physical activity to very low amounts down here. And within inside these physical activity categories, they were also able to create these categories of sitting time from low sitting up to high amounts of sitting. Some takeaway points from this study, and this is what the authors highlighted, was at very high levels, so this is 60 to 75 minutes of moderate intensity per day, it appears that very high levels of physical activity can offset or mitigate the health effects or the effects of increasing amounts of sitting. But the other takeaway from this, and it's pretty clear, is that at lower levels of physical activity, and in particular very low levels of physical activity, it does not appear to provide that protection. So we still see, even that in those who are achieving the current recommendations, that there is a dose response with respect to sitting, which is more magnified in those that are doing very little physical activity. So it's really only the high levels of physical activity that appear to provide that protection. And they illustrated this in a heat map, and this is just to indicate that the highest risk is observed in those that are sitting for high amounts and doing very little physical activity. But I think what I was alluding to before is that the greatest effects of high amounts of sitting appear to be evident in those who are physically inactive, and which potentially identifies a key target group for reducing the time spent sitting across the day. And we've extended this a little bit further again in this cardiology reviews, and to apply a risk matrix approach to really highlight the interplay between sitting and physical activity. Of course, at very low levels of physical activity and high levels of sitting, it represents the highest level of risk. And of course, a person can reduce risk by either reducing the time spent sitting or increasing the time spent in moderate intensity physical activity. But of course, the greatest benefits can be derived from reducing sitting and increasing physical activity. So just to highlight that it's really important that we understand this interplay between high amounts of sitting and physical activity. And finally, just to quickly summarise some of the observational evidence, others have used device-based measures to look at the patterns of sitting time, and this is a study showing that as the bout of, or the duration of the sedentary period increases, the risk of all-cause mortality increases beyond that 10-minute bout mark. And similarly, this study applied an isotemporal approach where hypothetically 30 minutes of sedentary time was replaced with light intensity. And you can see reductions in risk, but greater reductions in risk associated with more moderate intensity physical activity, which is fairly intuitive. And of course, this study here in older adults has shown that the mean bout duration, as it increases, the risk of cardiovascular disease increases as well, irrespective of the total volume of sitting time. So I think what we did emphasize in this review article, that it's so important that we move beyond the constrained boundaries of epidemiological research and start to integrate or triangulate evidence from clinical experimental studies and also intervention studies. And I'm just going to focus now on some of the clinical experimental studies. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there is likely to be multiple physiological mechanisms involved in so explaining the health hazards associated with too much sitting. This was back in 2016, where a PhD student put forward a proposed mechanisms and used the red font to indicate where more evidence is required, or where it's only speculated that there are likely to be effects on physiological mechanisms. And as you can see, the greatest need for understanding mechanisms is for longer durations, because we're starting to, or most efforts have been directed at more acute benefits, and I'll come to that a little bit further. But I think one real key point when looking at the experimental evidence, and I alluded to this before, is that by definition, the countermeasure of sitting must be physical activity, because we know that definition is any bodily movement. So whether this is light intensity activity, or whether it's moderate, or whether it's vigorous intensity activity, it must be the countermeasure to too much sitting. And many groups, including ourselves, have started to apply clinical studies to manipulate the time spent sitting in a laboratory setting. And what we do here is we essentially invite participants to come in and sit for the day. And we contrast that to, and this is built off our observational evidence, we contrast this by including interruptions of activity, of brief breaks of 3 to 5 minutes across the day to break up that sitting time. So to get a more breaker sort of behavioural pattern. And there's been many studies, but I thought I'd just highlight one study which was undertaken in those with type 2 diabetes by Paddy Dempsey, where we had a 7-hour period in those with type 2 diabetes. We did feed them throughout the day. And we had 2 different types of breaks. One was light walking, and then the other one was a simple resistance activities, which could be performed in a static position. So we tried to incorporate a break type activity that a person could essentially still do at a work desk, for instance, and still not interrupt productivity. And this is a very much an N=1 type study. We were fortunate to have a visiting Finnish researcher who is utilising these EMG underwear, so you can ascertain the amount of electrical activity in the quadriceps, hamstrings, and glutes. And not surprisingly, sitting is where there's very little muscle activity, and as the intensity of physical activity increases, you can see here. But with this simple resistance exercises, and this is just the example of the rising from the chair, you can see that the engagement is quite extensive particularly in the glutes and also the thighs. So we're still getting a large amount of muscle activity through those simple resistance activities. So this is just summarising the results for the key or the primary outcomes, and this is looking at glucose and insulin. Remember, we want to, in people with type 2 diabetes, we want to avoid excessive rises of glucose in response to meals. And you can see here that with the introduction of the breaks, either light walking or simple resistance activity led to a substantial reduction in the response to a meal challenge. Remember, this is a crossover trial, so each participant did all three conditions, and reductions in insulin and small reductions in triglycerides. We then extended it to other outcomes, and this is just to highlight the impact on blood pressure, with prolonged sitting showing leading to a difference between the active breaks of around about 15 millimeters of mercury. That's quite substantial, and remember, many of these people were hypertensive, so that might explain some of that. So it appears that breaking up leads to benefits not only for blood glucose management, but also for blood pressure control in people with type 2 diabetes. Now, importantly, these studies have mainly been undertaken over acute periods, so we need to look at longer term periods. But in our recent Nature Cardiology Reviews paper, we wanted to highlight that there is now some evidence showing that the active breaks, as you can see here, there's this interplay between multiple mechanisms of cerebral blood flow, blood pressure, blood glucose, and vascular function, all of which have led to a more favourable situation, particularly for those that have advanced or have chronic diseases. So I've talked about the observational evidence and the experimental evidence. Where we are sort of just slowly picking up ground is looking at interventions from randomized controlled trials. But already we're starting to see physical activity guidelines, public health guidelines that are acknowledging not only the physical activity recommendations, but also broad recommendations on sedentary behaviour. We're seeing it in clinical practice recommendations, along with American Heart Associations, as this advisory of sit less, move more. Recently, in the last 5 years or so, there's been a number of studies that have been directed at understanding the impact of reducing adults' sitting time. I'll come back to the children in a second. And this is a systematic review of those studies that have specifically targeted reductions in sitting time. And importantly, most of these studies have been undertaken in a workplace setting. So that's where environmental change, like an introduction of a height adjustable workstation, and the combination of height adjustable workstations with an educational component and changes in policy, etc., have led to a reduction of 35 to 40 minutes or so. Those that are just based solely on education and motivation have yielded a more diminished response. But I think it highlights that these types of interventions are feasible for making changes in behaviour. But how does that translate into changes in physical outcome or health outcomes? Well, we undertook a meta-analysis recently. This is again in adults, and you can see that there are some benefits, but these are quite small and quite modest. And I think, as you can see here, some of the fasting insulin. But the key here is that many of these studies have been shorter term. We really need longer term studies. We need studies that will not only focus just on the workplace setting, for instance, but also look at the home context as well. And importantly, for many of these studies, the use of biomarkers has really been that there have been secondary outcomes. So many studies have not been adequately powered to be able to detect any difference from the intervention. And most studies have been undertaken in otherwise healthy individuals, and this is pretty sound rationale for looking at this in those with chronic disease, for instance, those with type 2 diabetes, and studies are already underway looking at that. But of course, I just showed you the effects on in adults from interventions. There has been some recent studies looking at applying similar approaches in the school classroom, and this is Stacey Klenner's work from the UK, where we had a study that was undertaken in the UK around about the same time as we did this similar in Australia, where we had, these are just small pilot studies in primary school age children. In the UK, essentially what they did is have I think 3 or 4 desks at the end, at the back of the room, and the children rotated to these desks. And then in the Australian situation, the intervention classroom all got a height adjustable workstation. But if we looked at this and using the ActiPal measures for sitting time, we saw nearly equivalent reductions in the time spent sitting across the day for the UK example of up the back of the room and rotation, with the all interventions students getting the height adjustable workstations. But you can see that this is similar to what has been observed in the adults. We've now extended this into secondary schools, and this is the work of a former PhD student, Anna Contado, where we looked at in the first instance a natural experiment and just simply testing the impact of height adjustable work desks, so without any teacher training, etc. And then another school another study where we trained teachers, provided prompts, etc. And this is in year 7, 10 and 11 students. And we compare that to the traditional desk. So in the first instance, this is that more natural experiment. You can see that those that were provided with a height adjustable work desk, there was a difference in terms of the time that was spent sitting and standing compared to that of the standard classroom. This was over the average over a 70-minute session. And then in this one, where we had, I think it was about 4 to 17 weeks, 4 to 17 weeks here, we can see that there was a reduction in the sitting time with the introduction of the height adjustable workstations, whereas this remains sort of consistent throughout for the traditional classroom. So you can see that there is some evidence of potential feasibility of change in the school classroom. And this is another study I just finish off on with Joe Salmon, who's led this. This is the Transform Us study, which was a long-term study, and this involved 20 schools, etc. But it was randomized into 4 experimental groups where we focused on increasing only physical activity, reducing sitting only, and a combined approach compared with a control group. And I just wanted to, here we go. This is graph measured sedentary time at 30 months. And you can see that the intervention that specifically targeted sedentary behaviour, not only in the classroom, but also in the home setting, led to a larger reduction in sedentary time than the combined and also the physical activity reduction approach. But importantly, even though these are preliminary type findings or haven't been published just yet, Joe's managed to work extensively here in Australia on the implementation of this approach, the Transform Us approach, and it's now being taken up by many Victorian primary schools, and you can find out more information about that program, the Transform Us, just showing that this has been now taken through to that implementation phase of research. And finally, what I've shown you in the presentation, I still think that we have a lot more work to do. And if I think about where the evidence is and use a traffic light type system, I think we got fairly good evidence from observational research and emerging evidence from clinical research, but we really need to embark on those interventional type studies, and in particular looking at this in various different contexts that people are exposed to high periods of sedentary behaviour. And within our annual reviews of public health, we summarise this as potential research directions. And I'll just walk through quickly here, is that we need to really start to apply these device-based measures in observational research to importantly look at the prospective relationships and not rely on cross-sectional studies, and to look at the patterns of sedentary time and chronic disease risk. And I think we're now starting to see studies extend this to other health-related outcomes, including musculoskeletal health and mental health, but I think we need more studies looking at that. There's also a need for looking at the relationships, particularly in older adults who are likely to have comorbidities or multiple clinical conditions, and understanding the role of sitting and the potential benefits of even standing or light intensity activity. And as I mentioned, we need to look at different contexts. But this is, if we look further down the research path, we need to start to build stronger partnerships with employer and employee representatives across government to promote healthier and productive environments. Okay, so I've essentially summarised 10 years of the research, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have, and I really appreciate you for listening. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Dunstan. I'm sure that we're all giving you a virtual round of applause and looking forward to hearing some Q&A. We have just over 15 minutes now, and we're starting to get questions in the chat and in the Q&A. So just as a quick reminder to participants, if you'd like to ask a question, there's a Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen, and you can go ahead and put in your question there. Just a couple of things. So first of all, I'll just start off with thank you for your talk here today. I know that you've been quite heavily involved in this topic for the last 10 years. One of your papers from 2012, the Too Much Sitting, a Health Hazard, you gave some specific recommendations for standing more and for sitting less. And so you said, stand up, sit more, move less, move more. And you had suggested using a headset or a speakerphone during teleconferences. And I see that you're wearing that now. So I guess my first question to you is, are you sitting or are you standing at the moment?
No, I can tell you that I'm working from my height adjustable workstation. So as I presented today, I use that very little more energy expenditure while standing as opposed to sitting. Great. Yes, so I am practicing what I preach.
There you go. Can you tell us a few more recommendations that you might make for us? I know that many of us are probably sitting at our desks right now, and you've had recommendations in a variety of your papers and reports. What are some things that you might suggest to the audience here today?
Yeah, there are various tips and strategies, and we welcome any further ideas. So please do send any strategies you may have. But I think we have to think about the different contexts, and think about in a workplace environment, for instance. Try scheduling in those breaks. Maybe use the top of the hour to use it as a time to actually get some movement and away from the desk, and the more movement that people can accumulate across the day obviously is going to offset some of those health hazards of too much sitting. Some others have started to incorporate walking meetings, and as we work from home, I've increasingly heard of people using headphones, AirPods, etc., to conduct their progress meetings whilst walking out in their local neighbourhood, which is fantastic. And also start to think about, well, maybe removing waste bins from offices, so they actually have to get up and go and put that into a centralised a waste bin, and of course walking and talking to colleagues who may be down the corridor as opposed to sending an email. I can also think about in the home setting. Many of us are watching, prolonged TV shows with increasingly with Netflix, etc. I think in between episodes, we should really be starting to think about getting up and moving around. I don't know how people could possibly sit for, long periods and watch every single episode. But at the end of each episode, I think importantly, we should get up and move around. We used to have the television commercials to help us with that every 20 minutes or so. So right. I think we should still apply that.
Yeah, we certainly don't have those natural breaks to some of those sedentary behaviors anymore. Thank you. I'm interested in kids, and I think a lot of the audience is here as well. So just maybe tell us a little bit about sedentary behavior tracking. So do inactive children become inactive adults? What do we know about that relationship across the period of growth and into early adulthood?
Yeah, and if we use self-reported measures, there's some evidence that does show that does track into adulthood. So those who are highly sedentary during their childhood, there is some evidence showing that it tracks into adulthood. And I think importantly, if we look at some of those health outcomes that, for instance, overweight and obesity, and I'm sure this audience knows that does also track into adulthood. So I still think that we need more evidence from device-based measures, and in particularly looking at those patterns of sedentary behaviour. But I think that there is already some evidence to really indicate that's why it's so important that we intervene early. So that we can prevent this next generation from becoming high sitters in multiple contexts.
Yeah, my 7 and 10-year-olds should be listening to this. Thanks very much. I know that we're sitting a lot more in schools as a result of COVID-19. Kids are either staying home and being homeschooled, or they're now in their classroom and not going too far beyond their classroom. Do you have any suggestions for school policymakers, teachers, or otherwise that are trying to get kids active in this time where we're quite restricted in terms of our movements?
Yeah, it's a big challenge, and our children here have spent nearly 5 months of remote learning, so we're pretty familiar with that, and I guess parents do face that challenge of working themselves and also watching children remote learning. And I think that this is where using simple rules like the top of the hour, there has to be some form of movement. And I think what can happen is we can get lost in our thoughts, and children can get lost in the task, and forget about getting up and moving around. So I think if I had to narrow it down to a number one strategy, I think using that top of the hour that the whole house can get up and move around, as long as it's not going to the fridge to get the the next sweet snack or sugar sweetened beverage. But I think encouraging as much movement as possible and break up that prolonged period of sitting.
Yeah, and I know teachers and parents are very creative, and I know that they are willing to be put to that task. We have a few questions that have come in. So first of all, Danilo Silva has said, "Great talk, Dr. Dunstan. What is your opinion about the definitions of cutoff points for sedentary behaviors for public health guidelines?"
Cutoff point for the 1.5 METs, is that?
I believe that's the question, yes.
Yeah, well, there is some contention, but I think that I like the definition in that it has a postural element to it. So it is while a person is sitting and lying. I think where the contention is whether it's 1.5, whether it's 1.3, 1.2 METs. But I think what we need to emphasise that when we are sitting, there is very low energy expenditure. And as I showed with the shorts, there's very low amount of muscle activity. So I think that I'm happy with the definition, but I think there is still some greyness relating to what is the actual cut point for energy expenditure for sedentary behaviour.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from Chris McNeil. He's asking about the Auckland meta-analysis and was wondering the age range of the 1 million participants.
Yeah, and thanks for your question, Chris. And I should have highlighted this. And this was a large age range, and this was adults, and this could have ranged from the 30 right up to the very old, into the 80s and 90s. Majority of studies have been around about that 50 to 60 year olds. So I think that we still have a lot more work to do to understand that whether this is holds true in those younger populations, and of course even younger populations.
Yes,
than adults. Yeah.
Right. And I think that relationship between physical activity and sedentary behavior, obviously you've done so much work there. You presented that study as well as the KidSmart6 study in your work. So I think I'm convinced that I either have to become really athletic or I need to break up my sitting time more through some of that evidence. But speaking of children then, where should we focus our attention? Should we focus our attention on getting kids more active through unstructured and structured play, through other physical activity types of interventions, or are we focusing on decreasing sitting time, and where should the focus be?
Well, I don't think that it's an or conjunction. I think it's an and. It has to be an and. But I think what we do know, if we look at evidence, that the bulk of the evidence does indicate that the moderate to intensity activity is where you get the greatest benefits, just based on what we have observed in the literature. But coming back to that, there are various contexts where engaging in high amounts of moderate intensity activity is unlikely to be feasible. And I use the school classroom as a great example. And this is where this conjunction, the and part, could come in. And I think that we potentially are missing out on some, even if it's small benefit, from avoiding prolonged periods of sitting and having more movement in the classroom. And then, of course, on top of, and then in addition to, the promotional messages directed at moderate intensity type or vigorous intensity type activities. I really don't think that we can break this up into an or. It must be an and.
Excellent point. Thank you. We have Christy Ept, who says, great presentation. What do you think are the main barriers to getting people to sit less? And she was wondering for both adults and for children. Yeah,
and it's a really great question, and there are likely to be multiple influences here. And if I just take one context, for instance, the workplace context, for us in academia, it's a little bit easier for us to actually break up our sitting time, whereas there are industries like, for instance, call center staff, where that environment and the cultural aspects or cultural environment really is directed at long periods of sitting. Whereas in academia, we have that discretion to get up and move around. But I think we need to think that it's not just about people's motivation to sit less and move more. We have to factor in that there are environments that are highly conducive to long periods of sitting, and the school classroom is another example. Of where it's culturally the norm to sit for long periods of time, and I'm really heartened to start to see some of the teachers here, even in my local primary school, that are really getting these kids up and learning while they're moving.
Yeah, and mine as well. That's great. Thank you. Another question around measurement. And so I know that this is an area that you've dug your teeth into for the last little while in measuring sedentary behaviors. As research grade monitors can be quite expensive, do you have any suggestions for commercial grade monitors that can be used still in a research context? And that's from Ruth Brady.
Yeah, this is where there's a real big gap in the commercial wearables. And I think we are seeing reasonable evidence that they're okay for measuring activity, and particularly steps. But at the low end of that physical activity spectrum that I mentioned, the commercial wearables, particularly those that are worn on the wrist, really, there's not great evidence showing that they're highly accurate for measuring the sedentary. So it's really a bugbear of mine that I think that we need to invest more or help promote that within the commercial wearables, that this is the full spectrum. We need to be able to capture that lower end of the spectrum as well. And worn on the wrist, it's more of a challenge to be able to ascertain how long a person's sitting.
Thank you. Yeah, Karen Pfeiffer, who's past NASPEM president, she's saying, thanks for the great talk. If physical activity is the countermeasure for sedentary behavior, what's the rationale for viewing sedentary behavior as its own entity rather than the opposite of physical activity?
Well, I think we have to take into account, and I showed this for the average Australian adult, the volume of time. Yeah, the most striking is time spent in sedentary behaviour. So this is a behaviour that people are doing throughout. The opposite, the behaviour that people are not doing, clearly is engaging in regular physical activity. And I think that by acknowledging that it is a high volume behaviour, and in the past, we've really channeled all our efforts into moderate intensity. And you look at most public health guidelines have been channeled into moderate intensity. And really that represents, in US populations, for instance, it's only 5% of the day. So it's a small proportion. And I think that what we have to think about, and that's why I'm encouraged by the 24-hour movement guidelines, is to really start to look at the full picture here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. We're running short of time and there are a couple of other questions, but if the questions haven't been answered, then feel free to email me at sarah.moore@dal.ca and I can pass those along to Dr. Dunstan. Certainly, we know that only 3% of Canadian children and youth are meeting the movement guidelines during the pandemic. So this is problematic and we want to make sure that we're not tracking those unhealthy behaviors into the later adolescence and early adult years. So thanks very much for your talk today. Our next webinar is on December 11th at 11 o'clock with Dr. Kelly Nicotropoulos. And so she'll be presenting on exploring the 24-hour movement behaviors. Dr. Dunstan, you might be interested in this, looking at the utility of those in children and youth with disabilities. And so look for more information about that on our Facebook and our Twitter accounts and in your email inboxes later on. If you'd like to hear more about that, or if you have more questions for Dr. Dunstan, then you can email me at sarah, sarah.moore, M-O-O-R-E, @dal.ca. And otherwise, on behalf of NASPEM, the board and directors, thank you so much, Dr. Dunstan, for joining us today. And thank you to the audience for being here today. I guess we should all get standing up and get moving. And Dr. Dunstan, thank you again. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye for now.